Understanding the impact of separation, grief, and loss is essential knowledge for anyone who wishes to foster or adopt a child. Yet many parents and professionals are missing this essential knowledge. In this 2-hour theme, we look at several factors that contribute to why we miss and misinterpret a child's grieving. Children's grief often looks different than adult grief. Children often express their grief in their behavior. It may look like the child is misbehaving when really they are just hurting. Loss and grief can be tough issues to talk about in general, but as a society, we really don't know how to recognize and respond to ambiguous losses. There are no rituals and customs that we can draw on to support a child who's been separated from their family. And how do we grieve a family that's still out there in the world? That is hard for us to understand, but even harder for a child. Children need help understanding their grief, and they need support in dealing with it. Along with ambiguous loss, American Indian, Alaska Native families and children can carry with them the ongoing effects of intergenerational and historical trauma. Sometimes we don't want to see a child's pain because it is painful for us, and it may stir up our own unresolved losses. It is essential that we help parents who foster or adopt recognize grief for what it is and help facilitate and support a child as they grieve. Now let's talk about the nuts and bolts. First, we listen to part of a podcast featuring Dr. Greg Manning, a psychologist who specializes in helping children deal with loss and grief. Dr. Manning makes several important points that will be expanded upon throughout the theme. Grief is a normal response to loss. Grief can be confusing and scary for children, especially children who feel unsafe and unsupported by others. Children often express their grief through challenging behaviors. Parents who are fostering or adopting play a crucial role in helping a child grieve their losses. Section 2 looks at the impact of unresolved loss and grief and how this can interfere with forming new relationships. In this section, we define ambiguous loss. Remember, even children who were adopted as infants or those who were being cared for by kin can also experience ambiguous loss as they deal with unanswered questions and the what ifs. Many children who have experienced significant losses too early in life may be in survival mode. They can't move forward in their grief process because the situation is unclear. Even if the child's parents are not physically present, they will remain psychologically present for the child. This section includes 2 important activities. Imagining profound loss in American Indian, Alaska Native children is a guided imagery activity where participants take part in a role play to imagine the losses a child might encounter when being in multiple foster placements. The losses are written on a small stone and placed in a container that the person playing the child is carrying. As the container grows heavier, we point out that this can signify how American Indian, Alaska Native children might struggle with the weight of the grief and loss they carry. Participants are encouraged to help by removing a rock from the container and replace it with a positive, affirming statement to the child. A second activity relevant to American Indian, Alaska Natives refers to reviewing items on a historical loss form. This is accompanied by the inclusion of cultural factors that can help to serve as healing buffers. In Section 3, we take a deeper dive into understanding the ways that grief and loss may be expressed in the child's behavior. We begin with an excellent clip from the Foster documentary featuring a child named Sydney, describing her experiences in previous foster homes as she dealt with numerous moves and losses. Sydney describes how this began to change in her current foster home, the home of Mrs. Beavers. Mrs. Beavers, an experienced and remarkable foster parent, talks about the losses that many of the children that have come into her home have faced. It's clear that Mrs. Beavers gets it. She knows what is underneath the behaviors, and she knows how to support children in their grief. We follow the video up with exploring common grieving factors and key factors in the experience of loss, such as the child's developmental level and how the loss was communicated to the child, to name a few. Section 3 concludes with a video featuring Debbie Riley, adoptive parent, therapist, and CEO of the Center for Adoption Support and Education. Here are some of her key points. The loss of a parent, even if the child was never raised by them, is a real and profound loss. Separation from siblings is a profound loss, even if visitation occurs, but more so if there's no visitation. We don't always recognize the grief responses of children, but grief must be addressed in a supportive way. Sometimes this will require assistance from a mental health professional. Patience, listening, and validation of the child's feelings are essential. Finding forms of connection to loved ones supports the grieving process and allows for healing. Parents who foster and adopt need clear information and strategies to know how to address grief and loss with the child, and this is covered in Section 4. Tips include being willing to have difficult conversations about loss and grief, being willing to initiate the conversations, helping the child tell their story through life books or other means, being aware of one's own grief history and possible triggers. In Section 5, Skill Building, we use a case example to practice how to recognize signs of grief and loss in a 13-year-old boy. Here are the key takeaways. Grief is a normal response to loss. Helping a grieving child is an active process, and parents who foster or adopt need strategies and skills to support a child in this process. American Indian Alaska Native children can additionally be impacted by historical trauma and intergenerational grief and loss, which can be buffered through cultural means. Grief work takes time and patience. Here are some tips for areas that may be tricky. This whole concept may be new to many prospective foster and adoptive parents who, like many, may come to the training having thought only about the positives and benefits of foster care and adoption. Some of the activities can trigger parents' own unresolved loss and grief and is not necessarily a bad thing. Helping a parent recognize their own loss and grief issues is an important piece of self-awareness. It also allows us to give those good reminders about the importance of self-care. Of course, this also applies to us as facilitators. In closing, helping prospective foster and adoptive parents develop a deeper understanding of the children they may one day parent is an essential part of helping prepare them for the realities of parenting a child who has experienced loss. With this knowledge, parents will be more prepared to successfully meet the needs of children.